foreshadows Christ in the New Testament. Help Carson now as he leads our thoughts. I pray that we can learn, and we can grow, and we can study well. Help us, Lord, to encourage one another tonight. We're so thankful, Lord, for your Son. In his name that we pray. Amen.
So for this class, you're going to have to bear with me a bit, because we're going to go back and forth between multiple sections of the Bible, because the concepts that we're going to talk about practically require us to do all that jumping around. We will spend a lot of time in Hebrews, though, if you'd like to mark that book real quick. Now, for those of you who are either visiting or couldn't make it for either of the last 2 Wednesday nights, what we're doing this quarter is we're looking at Old Testament shadows of Jesus. 2 classes ago, Ryan helped clear the water a bit by describing what exactly these shadows look like. And if you remember, he had the illustration with his hand against the wall here. Let's see, lighting's, sorry, maybe the lighting's not like perfect for this, but anyway, so you can see here that the whiteboard, there's a shadow that is basically some kind of representation of my hand here. In the shadow, you can see a few details. Like you can see I have 5 fingers. You can see the vague general shape of the hand. But again, this is a 2-dimensional representation of a 3-dimensional object, so you can't get the complete picture here. So basically, the point though is that it can tell you some things about the hand itself while not serving as a perfect substitute. In the same way, there are quite a few Old Testament figures, events, locations, and institutions who resemble Jesus in some way. In other words, they foreshadow Jesus in the New Testament. And so each class, there will be a different person leading, and he'll focus on a particular shadow to talk about. Last week, Ryan Giesing did a great job talking about the sacrificial system in the Old Testament and how it served as a shadow of Jesus, who became the perfect sacrifice when he gave his life on the cross. So the timing of this wasn't intentional, but I think that Ryan's discussion about the sacrificial system flows nicely into the topic that I have today, which deals largely with the priesthood. We're not going to turn to all of these verses. I'll just be listing off a few relevant facts, and you can check the verses for proof if you want. Now, if we recall, priests were among those who were authorized by the law of Moses to make sacrifices on behalf of the people of Israel. In other words, they were to atone for the sins of Israel by making those sacrifices. And it's worth noting that there were a number of qualifications for the priesthood, a very important one being that they had to be able to trace their genealogy to Aaron, the brother of Moses and the first high priest under the law. Aaron, of course, was from the tribe of Levi, which is something that you should just keep in the back of your mind, as we'll come back to this later. On the slide, there are some duties associated with priests under the law of Moses. Beyond making sacrifices, as I said before, priests had to teach the people about the ways of God. In Leviticus 10, in the verses that I have up there, God charged Aaron with distinguishing between the unclean and the clean, and with teaching the people of Israel every law given to Moses by God. So not only does the priest have to atone for the sins of the people, he also has the responsibility of instructing them so that they can stay on the right path in the first place. Now, beyond this, priests have also served in the role of arbitrators or judges who have the authority to settle matters of controversy among the people. Additionally, they bless the people of Israel. Now, this isn't an exhaustive list by any means, but I think it captures enough of the essence of biblical priesthood for me to open up the discussion to you all. Just off the top, before we dive much deeper into the material, are there any similarities that you can draw between the duties of priests, either the ones I have up here or others that you may think of? Some similarities between those duties and what we know of Jesus from what the Gospels tell us.
Just really high level, if you think of the priest as the go-between who can intercede and help connect man and God when otherwise they'd be separated, that I think is the foundation for what Jesus is going to do.
Exactly. Priests in the Old Testament served as kind of a mediator or intercessor, basically between man and God. And if you recall in the story of the crucifixion, when Jesus died, the curtain that separated, I guess, the rest of the temple from the holy place, tore in half from top to bottom, basically kind of destroying that barrier that we had, that barrier of intercession that we had with the old priests, because now Jesus serves as our perfect mediator between us and God. So yeah, that's great. Any other similarities that you might draw between priests and what we recall from Jesus in the New Testament? I do have one. So in the section here, the note up there where I talked about the priests having the responsibility of teaching the people. Think about how extensively Jesus taught the law with a level of knowledge that consistently astounded onlookers. I'm thinking of passages like Luke chapter 2, where he as a young boy sat among the teachers of the temple, asking them questions and providing answers that demonstrated a serious understanding of the law. And you would also have to think about his other sermons, the Sermon on the Mount, and then you'd have to recall Matthew chapter 5 and verse 17, where he announces that Jesus has come to fulfill the law, the spirit of the law. So, in other words, he's teaching a higher form of the law, in essence, fulfilling the duty of the priests here. And of course, he also gave numerous overt blessings to people, most notably the Beatitudes in Matthew chapter 5. So already, we can see some clear ways in which Jesus very much emulated and even surpassed the priesthood during his time on earth. Now, with the foundation set in place, let's make our first visit to Hebrews. If you have a Bible handy, could you turn over to Hebrews chapter 5? I mentioned earlier that we'd be in Hebrews a lot, and the reason for that is because Hebrews talks quite a bit about the priesthood, and specifically its connection to Jesus. The whole book, the author is trying to persuade converts not to fall back into Judaism, because the ministry of Jesus supersedes what you'll find in the Old Testament. And specifically in chapter 5, he's showing how Jesus is the perfect high priest, a notch above the ones that we read about in Exodus and Leviticus. So could someone please read for me the first 10 verses of Hebrews chapter 5?
For every high priest chosen from among men is appointed to act on behalf of men in relation to God, to offer gifts and sacrifices for sins. He can deal gently with the ignorant and wayward, since he himself is beset with weakness. Because of this, he is obligated to offer sacrifice for his own sins, just as he does for those of the people. And no one takes this honor for himself, but only when called by God, just as Aaron was. So also Christ did not exalt himself to be high priest, but was appointed by him who said to him, "You are my son, today I have begotten you." As he says also in another place, "For you are priest forever under the order of Melchizedek." In the days of his flesh, Jesus offered up prayers and supplications with loud cries and tears to him who was able to save him from death. And he was heard because of his reverence. Although he was a son, he learned obedience through what he suffered. And being made perfect, he became the source of eternal salvation to all who obey him, being designated by God as high priest after the order of Melchizedek.
Thank you. So this passage can be a bit tricky to parse out, but it is easier to understand if you think of the last 6 verses, verses 5 through 10, as mirroring the first 4. To illustrate this better, I had to use some notes from a high school class that Ryan taught about Hebrews over 2 years ago. They came in very handy here. So basically, in this passage, the author is drawing a comparison between the old priests chosen from among men and Jesus. The first big commonality that they seem to share is the fact that they were both appointed by God. The proof offered for this being the case with Jesus is interesting. The quotation in verse 5, "You are my son, today I have begotten you," is taken directly from Psalm 2 and verse 7, and it also echoes Jesus' final words on the cross as recorded by Matthew and Mark. my God, why have you forsaken me?" There's definitely a fun conversation about the relationship between Jesus the Son and God the Father in that rabbit hole, but the key takeaway that I want you to focus on here is that Jesus was divinely appointed to the position of high priest in much the same fashion as the Old Testament high priests. And then another thing that we ought to consider is the role of sacrifice. Ryan Giesing already did a great job covering the relationship between the old sacrificial system and Jesus, so I won't rehash too much there. But it is worth noting the grammar here. In verse 1 of chapter 5, the words gifts and sacrifices are mentioned, plural, because they had to be made over and over again with the persistence of sin among the Israelites. These sacrifices had no true lasting power. They formed only a temporary atonement. But with Jesus in verse 9, there's a nice sense of finality that you don't get with the Old Testament priesthood. With his sacrifice, Jesus became the source of eternal salvation for all who obey him. Just one source this time, not many. Now the third point over here that I have up here requires a little more explanation, and you need a bit of context from the previous chapter to really understand all of it. To start off, let me read verse 2 again. He can deal gently with the ignorant and wayward, since he himself is beset with weakness. So the Old Testament priests, they served as capable mediators between man and God because they could relate to man. Priests were humans too. They could be tempted. They could sin. And so in that sense, they could essentially relate with the people and the temptations that they were dealing with and some of the sins that they were committing. But Christ is a better mediator still. I'll read from the previous chapter, chapter 4, in verse 15. For we do not have a high priest who is unable to sympathize with our weaknesses, but one who in every respect has been tempted as we are. Importantly, yet without sin. Jesus was very much tempted, just like all human beings are, and Satan threw the whole kitchen sink at him for 40 days in the wilderness. The difference is, though, that Jesus, unlike the Old Testament priests, was completely, utterly without sin, even throughout all of that temptation that he may have endured. And so even though he endured the same challenges that we did, he set a perfect standard for how we are to follow God's path in this world. So he has the ability to relate to us just like the Old Testament priests, just without that extra baggage of sin. So that's everything I have for that passage. It is pretty dense, so there may be some things I mentioned. Does anyone have more to add about what we read in the comparison between Old Testament priests and Jesus, our new high priest? Okay, so in all of this, we have ignored a pretty big problem with this idea that Jesus is the perfect high priest. You guys remember which tribe the priests were supposed to come from according to the law of Moses? Exactly, that's right, Levi. Now, which tribe did Jesus come from? Judah. All right. We see genealogies of Matthew and Luke that trace him back to King David, who we know was a descendant of Judah. And that's partly why the Bible makes a big deal out of his being the son of David, basically the heir to the throne of Israel. You see images of Jesus as the king plastered all throughout the New Testament, particularly in places like Matthew. Now, how do we reconcile this with this whole high priest idea if we know that under the law of Moses, only Levites can be priests? What happened here? A Jewish audience might take issue with this, saying that you can't have it both ways. You can't have Jesus be both the king and successor of David and a priest when he comes from a tribe that is mutually exclusive to the idea of a priest. So a clue, though, that could point us in the right direction is in the passage that we just read. In verses 5 and 10 of chapter 5, Jesus is described as a priest after the order of Melchizedek. So in verse 10 it says, Jesus being designated by God a high priest after the order of Melchizedek. So now that opens up a whole new can of worms. We finally arrived at Melchizedek himself. I would ask you to turn over a page and leave a marker over at Hebrews chapter 7. We're going to come back here in just a little bit. But for now, let's go all the way back to Genesis chapter 14. Melchizedek is a very interesting biblical figure because the Bible spends much more time, talking about him than it does actually showing him. Sorry. Melchizedek only appears in a couple of verses in the book of Genesis, and then he never shows up ever again. But there's still actually quite a lot that we can learn about him in just those few verses. This will be a shorter reading. Can someone read for me Genesis chapter 14, verses 18 through 20?
And Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought out bread and wine. He was priest of God Most High, and he blessed him and said, Blessed be Abram by God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth. And blessed be God Most High, who has delivered your enemies into your hand. And Abram gave him a tenth of everything. And the king of Sodom said to Abram, Give me the persons, but take the goods for yourself. But Abram said to the king of Sodom, I have lifted my hand to the Lord, God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth, that I would not take a thread or a sandal strap or anything that is yours, lest you should say, I have made Abram rich. I will take nothing but what the young men have eaten and the share of the men who went with me. Let Aner, Eshcol, and Mamre take their share.
Thank you. So, specifically in verses 18 through 20, what are some things that you notice about the way that Melchizedek is presented in these few verses? There's a lot of interesting things in just these three.
King of Salem, thought that was neat, because Salem is the suffix of Jerusalem, and
Hmm.
that's where Jesus spent a great deal of his time.
Yeah. And as we'll see in Hebrews, which I'll talk about later. In Hebrews 7, the author makes an interesting point about when it says King of Salem, it means King of Peace, and we'll get to why that's the case later. But yeah, anything else?
Melchizedek is both, sorry.
Oh, oh yeah.
Melchizedek is both king and priest.
Exactly. He seems to resolve this apparent contradiction that the kingly office and the priestly office are two mutually exclusive things. He seems to resolve a bit of that. And we're going to talk a little bit later and elaborate on this resolution here. Because it's not the only place that those offices are kind of enmeshed in the Bible. Any other things? Okay. One other thing that's kind of like a tangent, he brought up bread and wine, which, I mean, this could also potentially be a shadow of the Last Supper and the Lord's Supper that we commemorate every first day of the week here. Yeah, that's just a little tangent that I thought was interesting about that passage. I would take note of the fact that Melchizedek is speaking to Abraham here. And we know that Abraham lived well before the Levitical priesthood that started with Aaron. In fact, even Levi himself hadn't been born yet, as he was Abraham's great-grandson, I believe. And yet we still have a priest of God here with the name of Melchizedek. This suggests that at least some form of the priesthood existed before the time of Moses, a priesthood that didn't necessarily require being a Levite. And we're going to keep referring to this type of priesthood as a priesthood after the order of Melchizedek, as opposed to the Levitical order of priests that would begin with Aaron. The book of Hebrews extracts a little bit more from this passage. Turn back with me finally to Hebrews chapter 7, and we will start at the top of the chapter. Just like with Hebrews chapter 5, can I get someone to read the first 10 verses?
For this Melchizedek, king of Salem, priest of the Most High God, met Abraham returning from the slaughter of the kings and blessed him. And to him Abraham apportioned a tenth part of everything. He is first, by translation of his name, king of righteousness, and then he is also king of Salem, that is, king of peace. He is without father or mother for genealogy, having neither beginning of days nor end of life, but resembling the Son of God, he continues a priest forever. See how great this man was, to whom Abraham, the patriarch, gave a tenth of spoils. And those descendants of Levi who received the priestly office have a commandment in the law to take tithes from the people, that is, from their brothers, though these are also descended from Abraham. But this man who does not have his descent from them received tithe from Abraham, and blessed him who had the promises. It is beyond
One might even say that Levi himself, who receives tithes, paid tithes through Abraham, for he was still in the loins of his ancestors when Melchizedek met him.
Interesting. There's a lot to pick apart in this passage. The first thing, as the author notes, Melchizedek is a name that translates roughly from the Hebrew as king of righteousness, Melech meaning king, and Zedek meaning righteousness. And we also see in the text of Genesis that he is the king of Salem, which the author of Hebrews regards as meaning the king of peace. Now, there are some reasons why that might be. Personally, the most convincing one is that Salem looks an awful lot like the word shalom, which means peace. And that's probably what the writer of Hebrews is getting at when he calls him the king of peace, in addition to being the king of righteousness. Note also that Abraham gave a tenth of the spoils to him, which Hebrews directly compares with the duty of Levitical priests to collect tithes from the people. And as we've mentioned before, it is also the duty of priests to bless the people, and we see that Melchizedek indeed blessed Abraham. Because of this tithe and the blessing, the author of Hebrews suggests that Melchizedek had some kind of religious authority over Abraham, which would be a bit of a shock, perhaps to readers, since Abraham was literally a patriarch to whom God made the promise that is echoed most throughout the Old Testament. Hebrews also makes a very interesting argument in verse 3 of chapter 7, noting that, and I'll read here, he is without father or mother or genealogy, having neither beginning of days nor end of life. But resembling the Son of God, he continues a priest forever. So, he's noting here that Melchizedek lacked a genealogy that you would typically see. In the Genesis story, he just kind of appears at the right time, and then we never hear from him again. I'm not entirely sure what to make of this, and I've read multiple interpretations on what this verse may be saying. Some actually read it as implying that Melchizedek was not only a shadow of Jesus, but actually Jesus himself. Since, of course, we know from the first chapter of John's Gospel that Jesus lives forever and he existed in the beginning of creation before taking flesh. Others take a less literal approach, arguing that Melchizedek was indeed a man who had parents and who passed away eventually. It's more so the way that he's presented in the Genesis narrative that's meant to resemble the unchanging and pre-existing nature of Christ. Some Jewish tradition, and this is really interesting, some Jewish tradition suggests that Melchizedek was actually Shem, the son of Noah, who may still have been living at around the time of Abraham. As the firstborn of Noah, the title of king may have made some sense as well. Again, I can't give you a definite answer in this passage, which is why this part's not on the slide there, but those are just some of the things that I've read. Now let's talk real quick about the idea of a priest-king. Traditionally, those two roles were kept separate in Old Testament times, primarily because, as I mentioned before, the Davidic line of kings was of the tribe of Judah, while priests in the lineage of Aaron came from the tribe of Levi. But there are other Old Testament references to a future priest-king besides this one sole mention of Melchizedek in Genesis. Turn over to the book of Zechariah for a bit. We will be in chapter 6. And Zechariah is a bit obscure as far as prophets go, but it's right before Malachi if you're having trouble finding it, the last book of the Old Testament. So can I get a reader for Zechariah chapter 6, verses 9 through 13?
The word of the Lord also came to me, saying, take an offering from the exiles, from Hadiah, Tobijah, and Jediah, and you go the same day and enter the house of Josiah the son of Zephaniah, where they have arrived from Babylon. Take silver and gold, make an ornate crown, and set it on the head of Joshua the son of Jehozadak, the high priest. Then say to him, thus says the Lord of hosts, behold, a man whose name is a branch, for he will branch out from where he is, and he will build the temple of the Lord. Yes, it is he who will build the temple of the Lord, and he who will bear the honor and sit and rule on his throne. Thus he will be a priest on his throne, and the council of peace will be between the two offices.
Interesting. So to add some context, Zechariah prophesied at a time when the people of Israel had returned from exile in Babylon. And at the same time, Haggai, who was another prophet, who actually comes before Zechariah in the Old Testament, Haggai was instructing the people to rebuild the temple of the Lord. And Zechariah complements him nicely by instructing the people to rebuild their relationship with God. In chapter 6 specifically, God is describing a time when he will come to be with his people. And at that time, a crown shall be placed onto the head of the priest, a priest king. So as we see, there's already some hint at a connection between the priesthood and kingship here, which adds even more credibility to this idea of Melchizedek being a priest king. These two offices are really not quite as separable as one might think. Now, you don't have to turn there, but Psalm 110, verse 4, tells us that there will be a priest who will serve forever after the order of Melchizedek. There will be another priest king. That office didn't begin and end with Melchizedek. There will be another priest king, and this office will be achieved not necessarily by a Levitical priest. And that is where Jesus enters the picture, being both the successor of the throne of David and the priesthood, but this time the priesthood of Melchizedek. Any extra thoughts on this brief passage before we go back to Hebrews? Okay. Now that we have properly established who Melchizedek was and what kind of priesthood he had, let's connect some more dots in the study and properly compare Jesus to Melchizedek. Come back now to Hebrews chapter 7. So this next reading, which should be close to our last for today, will put the finishing touches on this elaborate argument that Jesus represents a greater priesthood than the line of Aaron. Can I get someone to read Hebrews chapter 7, verses 11 through 22? 11 through 22.
Now, if perfection had been attainable through the Levitical priesthood, for under it the people received the law, what further need would there have been for another priest to rise after the order of Melchizedek, rather than the one named after the order of Aaron? For when there is a change in the priesthood, there is necessarily a change in the law as well. The one of whom these things are spoken belonged to another tribe, from which no one has ever served at the altar. For it is evident that our Lord was descended from Judah, and in connection with the tribe of Moses, and that said nothing about priests. This becomes even more evident when another priest arises in the likeness of Melchizedek, who has become a priest, not on the basis of a legal requirement concerning bodily descent, but by the power of an indestructible life. For it is witnessed of him, "You are a priest forever, after the order of Melchizedek." For on the one hand, a former commandment is set aside because of its weakness and uselessness. The law made nothing perfect. But on the other hand, a better hope is introduced, through which we draw near to God. And it was not without an oath. For those who formerly became priests were made such without an oath. But this one was made a priest with an oath, by the one who said to him, "The Lord has sworn and will not change his mind. You are a priest forever." This makes Jesus the guarantor of a better covenant.
Thank you. There are a great many things to note here, but I would first like to draw your attention to verse 12, which states that a change in the priesthood must necessarily suggest a change in law. It is not simply that the priesthood of Aaron went away and the law of Moses remained, because it was under that priesthood that the Israelites received the law itself in the first place. So when that goes away and it is replaced by a better priesthood, the law itself must necessarily be superseded by a better law. And it has to be this way, because if the Levitical priesthood was perfect, we would never have needed Jesus in the first place. We would never have needed Jesus, who was from a completely different order, to serve his role as our high priest. All of those animal sacrifices, they would have been perfect. But again, as I said before, we had to keep doing those animal sacrifices over and over again to cover all of the sins that the people of Israel would continue to commit over and over again. and priests would live out their lives and then die and have to be replaced by another priest. It was just this whole cycle of replacement that was useful to the people of Israel, but we have a better high priest now. It follows from here that the entire law of Moses has been superseded by a better covenant given by a better high priest, which we receive through the New Testament, through the Gospels, Acts, the Epistles, Revelation. And so here's where we get to the so what of this whole lesson. So for the original audience of Hebrews who were falling away from Christ back to the law of Moses, this message was to stop and think real carefully about what you're doing here. What you have in the Old Testament and what the Levitical priests have given you are merely, to quote chapter 8 and verse 5, copies and shadows of the heavenly things, which have been revealed to us by the perfect high priest. Like Ryan's hand analogy from before, once you have the real thing in your sights, there's nothing greater you can hope to learn by looking back at its shadow. There's nothing more that you can learn. It is strictly the better choice to stay with Jesus, no matter how hard that choice may seem in a time of great persecution. Today, this lesson from Hebrews helps us as Christians to put the Old Testament in its proper perspective. Important, useful, but ultimately fulfilled through Jesus. For as Jesus announced in Matthew chapter 5 and verse 17, he has come not to abolish the law, but to fulfill it. Now we have a higher form of the law given to us by a higher high priest. So I realize we have quite a bit of time left. And I know we've already covered quite a bit of ground in that short time. I would like to read one last section for myself, and then the lesson will be yours. I'll continue reading from chapter 7, starting in verse 23 and going on to the end of the chapter. I would pay particular attention to this passage because it's really an awesome description of Jesus as our eternal high priest. And it basically puts the nail in the coffin of any argument that the old law and the old priesthood was somehow better. That should be a nice bookend for this class. The former priests were many in number because they were prevented by death from continuing in office. But he, that is Jesus, holds his priesthood permanently because he continues forever. Consequently, he is able to save to the uttermost those who draw near to God through him, since he always lives to make intercession for them. For it was indeed fitting that we should have such a high priest, holy, innocent, unstained, separated from sinners, and exalted above the heavens. He has no need, like those high priests, to offer sacrifices daily, first for his own sins, and then for those of the people, since he did this once for all, when he offered up himself. For the law appoints men in their weakness as high priests, but the word of the oath, which came later than the law, appoints a son who has been made perfect forever. We still have a bit of time left. Do any of you all have comments on this lesson up to this point, some of the everything that we've covered about Melchizedek, about the priesthood, how Jesus fulfills these? Any comments on those?
I was thinking about this and what Ryan taught last week with the sacrificial system. The high priest is a constant reminder, one, of sacrifice, and two, of death. Life and then death immediately. And where that's gone away, and one eternal sacrifice has died, but now it's life everlasting. And what's magnified to me is life.
Mhm.
I think that's really interesting because even today, I mean, you don't think of it the same as what they would have then because they're constantly reminded of death. But here we're constantly reminded of life.
Exactly. And that's part of what makes this last passage just so beautiful, because it talks a lot about this idea of death being this constant obstacle. And I guess the old priesthood, like the priest would continue to die, and then they'd have to be replaced by new priests. Sorry. And then the whole issue with animals, the whole issue of animal sacrifice, which was talked about in the previous class, it was a constant reminder of death upon death upon death. If you look at places like Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, you'll see so much discussion describing in quite graphic detail sacrifices under the law of Moses. Again, it's as Dave said, it's this constant reminder of death and death and death. And then it's what makes you really start to appreciate this sort of finality with Jesus. Because he gave his life. He gave his life, just the one life. And then that covers everything. Like, from then on, it's life and life and life and life. And then we're even reminded of Jesus rising from the dead. It's life and life and life after this whole period of death and death and death. And that probably just gets to the core of maybe why Jesus is just so much better a high priest than those in the Old Testament. Great thoughts. Any more thoughts anyone might have? All right. I'm going to wrap this up a little bit earlier than expected, but I hope you all were able to learn a few things about Melchizedek, about how Jesus supersedes the priesthood in the Old Testament. Thank you all for your attention and the comments. Appreciate it.